My name is Lizzie Shea, and I welcome you to Judisk Kultur i Sverige and to Konstakademin, and to this very, very special evening dedicated to Baruch Spinoza. Today I put Spinoza's, no, he's not here, but a beautiful face, very impressive face on the Instagram, and I wrote Baruch Spinoza, rock star, because look at this turnout. We're very happy to have you here tonight, and very happy for the cooperation with Södertörn University and with Hans Ruin on arranging this long-due seminar with us. I'm going to leave the stage to Hans Ruin, who will introduce our guests, distinguished guests this evening. I can only say that there will be a presentation and music and an intermission, and then we can come back to the second presentation, music, and a short panel discussion, after which join us for a glass of wine at the cafe outdoors. So Hans Ruin, I'm not going to take more time because we're behind schedule. Please, Hans, thank you very much. And Hans Ruin is a professor of philosophy at Södertörn University and a co-arranger of this program. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Lizzie, and thank you everyone for coming. As Lizzie said, we are overwhelmed by the interest in this evening seminar. We started talking about this a number of years ago, I think even somewhat before the corona epidemic. And then it was postponed, like many other events, for several years. But now we are so happy that we're able to do this and that we have with us such excellent guests. I will just say 2 words about our main speakers to make you understand that I think we could not have better guides with us. When it comes to being introduced to both the work and the legacy and impact of Spinoza. Jonathan Israel, who is Professor Emeritus at the Princeton Advanced Institute, is the leading scholar on the Enlightenment in every possible aspect. He has written 4 volumes, altogether almost over 3,000 pages, on the political, scientific, philosophical, and social enlightenment, and I can warmly recommend his books. And if there is one underlying theme in this great scholarly work, it's the significance and role of Spinoza as an originator and the chief inspiration to what you speak of as radical enlightenment. And since this thesis, like all theses, has also been questioned by other scholars, Jonathan had to write a 5th book, which he just told us about last night, which is 1,300 pages. And this is a book which is only about Spinoza, and it will come out in a few months. So you know what you can read this summer. Jonathan will speak, we'll have some music, as Lizzie said, and then a short intermission. And then Yitzhak Melamed, our second guest, also from United States, from Johns Hopkins University, will speak. And Yitzhak is a very prominent scholar on Spinoza. I think you have 6 books on Spinoza, if we count the books that you have edited. How many essays, I don't know. He's written about the young Spinoza, the birth of a metaphysician, about Spinoza's metaphysics, about his ethics. You have edited several volumes on Spinoza's works, so there is, in every aspect of his work, you have contributed. And directly after Yitzhak's presentation, we'll also have some music, and then we'll gather here up on stage to have a conversation between us, and then we'll also have as our guest Karin Franzén, who is a professor in comparative literature, litteraturvetenskap, at Stockholm University. And I will say a little bit more about you when we get to that part of the program. So with this, I leave the floor to Jonathan Israel, please.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and I must say I'm so impressed by the audience, which very rarely have felt so impressed. Look very distinguished, and I'm enormously looking forward to our discussion this evening. Now, the first thing, everybody here, I'm sure, is aware that among the early modern philosophers, Spinoza was the most radical, the most subversive, the most daring in many ways, and that, of course, plays a large part in why he still matters now and why he's still important to us today. But I'd like to say, since I've just finished a biography, which, by the way, it is rather long, and I don't expect you to read it or buy it or anything like that. In fact, my wife was horrified when she discovered how long it was. But there really is a lot to say about Spinoza, so I'm hoping that in the end, at least some of the reviewers will say, well, perhaps the length is justified after all. Certainly, Spinoza is not a simple personality, and I think it's crucial to understanding how his daring, radical, subversive approach, not just to philosophy, but remember, Spinoza is very important as a critic of conventional religion, as a political thinker, and as a thinker about morality, of basic ethics, of how people should lead their lives. Of course, that is part of philosophy, but he's not a narrow philosopher by any stretch of the imagination. But he had to be very, very careful. So Spinoza is always, and I think this is one of the keys, perhaps the most important key to his personality, he was always a mixture of daring and caution. His personal maxim or guide to life was caute, be careful. His thought is so daring in terms of what was allowed and what was not allowed in his time in the 17th century that he had to be extremely careful, as did those who helped him. And that's an important point that I want to put some emphasis on during my talk, because Spinoza would never have had the success that he did without building up a small, rather secretive group who helped him with his research, especially helped with getting his books published and distributing them rather furtively, because they were, in terms of Dutch law at the time, illegal. I'll explain in what way they were illegal in a moment. And in helping to create something which was actually a movement, and which is recognized not just by Dutch writers, but French writers, and one of his best friends from his early years, who turned against him later and became a very devout Catholic leader, actually rose very high in the Catholic Church, though he was Danish and began as a Lutheran. That is Nicholas Steno. I'll mention Steno a couple of times because I think his criticisms, both of Spinoza and Spinoza's group, the team effort that I referred to, are really rather important and very interesting. So the first thing one has to understand about this man is that he's more radical and subversive than anyone else among the philosophers of the 17th or beginning of the 18th century, but he's also careful. He knows he's taking a lot of risks, so there's a good deal of camouflage going on here. So one of his the work, remember that his most important work, I better say a word about that first of all, the ethics. That's what Spinoza, especially among trained philosophers who have a very strict sense of what philosophy is, they tend to be most interested in the ethics, which was his masterpiece. He tried to get it published during his lifetime in 1675. He went to consult with his friends and with other people and his allies, made a real effort to get it published. They said, don't, it's too risky. You're in pretty hot water, don't. I should explain that one of his closest disciples and friends, Adrian Korbach, who was passionate about Spinoza's philosophy and just went ahead and published without much concealment or anything, even put his name on the text, the basic ideas in 1668. Adrian Korbach was intelligent, loyal, and a rather special person, was arrested immediately. He was tried by a large panel of magistrates in Amsterdam, and he was sentenced to a huge financial fine, which ruined him financially, and plus 10 years in prison. And he died a year later. So, I mean, Spinoza knew very well, and his friends did, the risk that they were running. They said, don't publish it. It's not worth it. And it didn't come out until after his death. The one very bold work, his second most important work, is this one, the Tractatus Theologico-Politicus. And notice, this was published in 1670 and caused a tremendous shock. I'll explain why Spinoza's opinions were so shocking in a second. But it did create an enormous shock, I can tell you. First in Holland, then in Germany. Leibniz was one of the people who was absolutely horrified in 1670 and 71. Then in England, then in France. And eventually the Inquisition learnt about it in Rome, and they were horrified as well. It was banned, put on the index by the papal authorities. But notice how it's published. This is absolutely typical to the story as I'm trying to explain it this evening. First of all, you don't put his name on it. That's very important. That was important to diffusing Spinoza's work and his bold ideas. But it was also very important to the reception of Spinoza in later years. The problem, I don't think any other philosopher has been attacked so many times in his own lifetime and in the years immediately following. So he died in 1677. If you took the next quarter of century or so down to the beginning of the 18th century, there are dozens and dozens of, nearly all in Latin, attacking his basic ideas, mostly by university professors or by church theologians. But a very, very large number of Lutheran, Calvinist, Catholic, Jewish, and other Anglican refutations, dozens and dozens of them, more, I think, than attacked any other philosopher. But at the same time, there was a rule that they nearly all adhered to. First of all, please don't publish any of these refutations in a language that most people can understand. So there was very, very little in English or Dutch or French to begin with until later years. It was mostly in Latin. Second, it is very important that ordinary people shouldn't understand what this man is saying. Therefore, however much hard we attack him, you do not mention his name and you do not attract attention to this person, because people shouldn't learn about Spinoza. That's the most important thing. I could give you, I'm not kidding, 30 writers who will tell you in the late 17th century, yes, we attack Spinoza's ideas, but the most important thing is to prevent people realizing that Spinoza is saying this and alerting people to the figure of Spinoza. People shouldn't know anything about Spinoza. That's more important than anything else. So, but in diffusing his own work, he had to do the same thing. So his name is never mentioned. You have the publisher is given as Henricus Kunrad, but there was no such person. That's completely fictitious. And it says that the book is published in Hamburg, where actually it was published in Amsterdam. So there was always camouflage. There was always a rather furtive story, and that's absolutely typical. Okay, now, so what is so terrible about Spinoza? Well, he, of course, the most shocking thing for most people in the late 17th century was the attack on conventional religion, or let's say religious authority. So, for example, Spinoza says there's no such thing as a miracle. There's never been any miracles. There never can be any miracles because there can't be anything supernatural. So everything that happens is part of nature. Of course, God and nature are the same thing in Spinoza, as probably everyone here knows that. And therefore, nothing can be beyond God or nature, and nothing can happen which is by definition, there never has been and never could be anything supernatural. That's one of the most basic principles in Spinoza. Therefore, all magic, all sorcery, all witchcraft, and all miracles, and anything supernatural that is supposed to happen according to religious, or have happened according to religious texts, is fictional, is a myth, because there can't be... He had a lot of respect for Jesus Christ. He thought it was a very important model of moral behavior, but he certainly didn't think that he'd been resurrected or that he had been conceived by an immaculate conception, or any of the other supernatural things that are supposed to have happened, nor did he think Jesus ever performed any miracles. Of course, all this is very shocking, Spinoza was always very clear that true religion, which is to love your neighbor and to be just and charitable, it's very interesting how he describes that, because he says that his philosophy is accessible. That's the point I'm going to come back to later in my talk. Is accessible to the ordinary person, because you could be an uneducated, simple person, and you can have the Spirit of Christ. This is how he puts it. It's very, very interesting. What is the Spirit of Christ? The Spirit of Christ is understanding that we should be just, we should be charitable, we should love our neighbors, and we should think about the common good. So the Spirit of Christ, some people have much more of the Spirit of Christ in them than others. But of course, what was so shocking for contemporaries was that that's absolutely nothing to do whatsoever with going to church, or which bishops you respect and which bishops you don't respect. All that is completely irrelevant. In fact, churches, Spinoza doesn't think churches have anything to do with real Christianity. After all, Jesus didn't found a church, did he? If you read the New Testament, there's nothing about a church. Jesus went to the synagogue, not to church. So he thinks the whole thing, from the church fathers onwards, is a huge fabrication, misleading and deceiving people, and it's all completely irrelevant. He says, in any case, because a Muslim or a Jew can have the Spirit of Christ much better than another person who goes to church every Sunday, but might be some mean person. And he's got less of the Spirit of Christ, so which church you go to has no relevance at all to how much of the Spirit of Christ is in you. So these ideas, these religious ideas, of course, are all very shocking. Equally, just to give another example, there's no afterlife, because the mind, or the soul, and the body are different aspects of the same thing, according to Spinoza's philosophy. So when the body dies, the mind dies with it, at least the individual mind existing in time and space dies with it. And just to give another example of how shocking his ideas on religion were to contemporaries in the late 17th century, who was famous for this. Stories about this spread long before even this terribly subversive work, the TTP, the Tractatus Theologico Politicus, first appeared in 1670. It was one of Spinoza's important points, and one of those that most shocked contemporaries, that there can't be such a thing as a sacred text. No one text can be more sacred than another text, because all texts are written by humans, and therefore they're all equal in status. And the story, this man has got his Bible on a shelf, and it's bound together with the Quran, I think, and Aesop's fables. This story began to circulate at a very early stage. That he doesn't put the Bible above Aesop's fables seemed unbelievably shocking to people at that time. Okay, so Spinoza is the most radical critic of conventional religion. He does think there's such a thing as true religion, and he thinks it's something very important, a bit like Einstein in the 20th century. There's true religion, but that's true religion. According to Einstein, true religion is taking the best bits out of Buddhism, Christianity, Islam, Judaism, put them together. I mean, surely that's better than any one of those religions separately. So it's got, and the last thing you should do is ever believe churchmen, because they've got a vested interest in trying to get you under their authority. So that's rather similar. And this total disregard for theology and for churchmen is, of course, one of the most shocking things about Spinoza. But the TTP and his other works are also very, very subversive in another sense. And this now gets us onto the subject of radical enlightenment, which is one of the points that I most want to stress in my talk. Now, it's perhaps in itself not so very original in Spinoza that he thinks monarchy is very bad for people because it concentrates power in the hands of one person who has very limited knowledge and is to some extent going to be the victim of his cleverest courtiers who are going to sort of create a culture around him and steer him in certain directions, or her if it's a queen. He thinks monarchy is very bad for society. He thinks that of course, the world he lived in early modern times put a lot of emphasis on the importance of aristocracy. if you grow up in society, the first thing you have to learn is if you're an ordinary person, you're nothing, and that aristocrats are a big deal. Aristocrats run things, and that's quite proper. They run society, they run politics, they run everything that really matters. I mean, if you have a diplomatic service or you need generals for your army, it goes without saying they should be aristocrats and shouldn't be other people. And that's terribly important for nearly all European countries, with the exception of one or two republics which were outliers, like the Dutch Republic. But even in the Dutch Republic, it was a kind of oligarchy where a small group of regents ran the country through the city governments and through the provincial councils. And Spinoza thought that some aspects, despite what I was saying before, it's nevertheless true that the Dutch Republic was more tolerant, because at least it allowed everyone to follow whichever religion they individually chose. And certain things you were not allowed to say. You couldn't criticize the government. There were political things you were not allowed to say, or foreign monarchs for that matter. There were political things you couldn't say. And there were religious things that were not allowed. It was against the law to question, for example, the doctrine of the Trinity. If you said that the Trinity doesn't make sense or is a contradiction in terms, you could be thrown in prison immediately, because there are very clear laws. You are not allowed to say anything against core Christian doctrine, against the Trinity, against the divinity of Christ. If you say, well, Jesus was a great man, but surely he's not God, you put him in prison. That just isn't allowed. And so there were very strict limits to religious freedom in the Republic when it came to questioning the sacred status of Scripture and so on, and core Christian theology. So Spinoza was obviously overstepping the bounds, and in all these respects, he was not allowed. Now, wherever in the Enlightenment of, what is the Enlightenment, of course? Let's just use, for the purposes of our discussion this evening, a very simple definition. In the wake of the scientific revolution of the 17th century, of the new mathematical way of measuring and thinking about science, which comes from, of course, from Galileo and Copernicus and so on, and discovering that the Earth goes around the sun and not the other way around, and understanding that observing nature more closely, drawing conclusions, forming scientific conclusions, that there is a mathematical way of reasoning, that this is the way that reason moves, and the more you use reason to organize education, society, politics, the more reason is used, the more rational, therefore, society is, the better that is for everyone. So if you can use science and reason to create a better, more efficient, happier society, you're making a more enlightened society. So all enlighteners, all of the Enlightenment agree on that. So most enlightenment, however, had to be enlightenment that could be publicly expounded and explained and projected, publicized, and for that you had to have the approval of the governments, which meant the kings, really, and the aristocracy, and you had to have the approval of churchmen, of the churches. And, of course, for the Jewish minority living at the edges of European society, you had to have the approval of the rabbis, who were also thinking in terms of deference to government. They didn't want to get their communities into trouble, so they didn't want anyone saying anything. For example, Jewish communities were very strict in the 17th century. However opposed to basic Christian principles they may have been in some manuscripts, which they kept rather secretive, the communities were told not to get into arguments about Christian doctrine. Don't do that, because you just endanger us all. So in a way, the Jewish communities and other minorities just went along with all these general rules. So moderate enlightenment is, yes, reason makes the world happier, but we accept all the things you're not allowed to criticize. You can't criticize core All enlightenment must accept it if it wants to be acceptable to governments and society. You can't criticize core Christian theology, you can't criticize kings, and you can't reject the principle of aristocracy. You can't go around saying, well, actually, a democratic republic would be a much better idea, because they'd throw you straight in prison. You're not allowed to do that. So moderate enlightenment, you'll see this phrase used a lot in discussions about the Enlightenment, is simply enlightenment that obeys the three great rules. Don't reject core Christian theology, don't reject kings, don't reject aristocracy. The combining of a rejection of religious authority with arguing for democratic republicanism has to be a secretive, camouflaged, furtive underground movement, and that's what we call radical enlightenment. You can immediately see radical enlightenment if it hides itself behind a screen, like that book, for example. Then and that it, like that book, it both rejects religious authority on the one hand, and it says that chuck kings and aristocracy in the wastepaper bin, because a much happier and better society would be a democratic republic. Then you know that's radical. So it's very easy to see the difference. It's actually extremely easy to see the difference between moderate enlightenment and radical enlightenment. It's clear-cut, logical, fits all the historical facts, and there can't be any serious question about it. The strange thing is that you'll find 150 historians and philosophers who come along and say, oh, no, we don't agree with that. And look how many of us there are. There are more than 100 of us who say that's wrong. And so it's become a huge discussion. But I don't believe that any of somebody even published an article called a mega critique of the criticisms, trying to draw a chart, sort of showing the general direction of all these criticisms. So there are an enormous number of criticisms, but they're all nonsense, because there aren't any arguments against this. It is one of those things that's very clear-cut, but it's very difficult, because it goes against the traditions of historiography and the way political thought, for example, has been presented. The way the traditional canon of political thought in European universities, and especially in English universities, which I could tell you quite a lot, but there won't be time for that this evening, about, well, actually, let's leave Spinoza out of it altogether. He shouldn't really be in the canon of history of political thought, because he's going to muck up the whole story. And everyone knows that progressive ideas come out of England anyway. So why are we talking about Spinoza? So there's quite a lot of opposition to this tendency in recent historiography and recent philosophical studies. And there are various reasons why a lot of scholars sort of gang up and try to argue against the division of enlightenment into moderate and radical enlightenment. But there aren't any good arguments. You won't find them. Every single critique consists of muddle, ignorance about the Dutch Republic, which is very common because most of these people don't read Dutch, so they don't know what's in all the works of Spinoza's disciples and allies and subordinates, Peter de la Cour, Adrian Korbach, who I mentioned before, Franciscus van den Enden, and so on, who are all combining rejection of religious authority with democratic republicanism, and all their books are banned. Van den Enden was hanged by Louis XIV for starting a rebellion in Normandy. He was hanged in 1674. So it was quite dangerous engaging in radical Enlightenment ideas. But although you may well find a lot of critiques against this schema for describing the Enlightenment, you won't find any good ones. That's important, or any that make sense in terms of the historical facts. Now, I've just a few minutes left. How many minutes have I got left? So I should say a bit more about the Jewish aspects, I think, of Spinoza's Enlightenment. And, of course, Spinoza had a very conventional Jewish background, that's agreed. So this meant that he went to the Sephardic Jewish school in Amsterdam, probably till he was about 14 or 15. What we know about the schooling system, there are a couple of descriptions from the 17th century. We know that it was very heavily geared to studying the Hebrew language, Hebrew grammar, the whole of the Old Testament, not just the Pentateuch, but the later books as well, were studied fairly intensively, but not much Talmud. They did do medieval Jewish philosophy, so Spinoza as a boy, probably even as young as 13, 14, probably he left school around 15. The story that he trained to be a rabbi and went into the upper classes of the Sephardic community education system seemed to be incorrect because they recorded the names and Spinoza's name is not found among them. it's best to assume that he left school around 15, and certainly his father, who was rather an important merchant and needed Spinoza's trading in Canary wines, in figs and almonds from Portugal. He imported a lot of grocery goods, which were in good demand in Holland from Portugal, and especially from Portugal and the Canaries. He'd been brought up in France, actually, Spinoza's father, so he didn't know Dutch very well, and he did need a lot of help with his commerce. So, and there is a story which other biographers of Spinoza don't take too seriously. Stephen Nadler, for example, who I think has published the best one to date, came out in 1999, says that doesn't sound very likely. Sebastian Courtauld, a German writer in the late 17th century, says that Spinoza's father and Spinoza hated each other. Now, I'm not so sure that that's so unlikely, because I think his father definitely didn't want him to go on with his studying. From what we know about Spinoza, studying was the only thing he was interested in, and he certainly wasn't interested in trading. But anyway, he would, at school, even at the age of 14 or 15, have learnt about Maimonides, Gersonides, Hasdai Crescas, and there was some connection between Spinoza's father and a later Jewish philosopher, Yosef Shlomo del Medico, from Crete, and he had, we know about Spinoza's reading habits up to a point, because when he died, a list was made. We have a detailed list of his 160 or so books. Sometimes there were 2 or 3 texts bound together in one volume. It's a bit hard to say exactly how many. There were roughly 160 books. So we can see what kind of reading culture Spinoza belonged to in quite good detail. And it's quite obvious. I mean, nearly everything he wrote was in Latin, and most of his books were in Latin. So after he was studied Latin, actually with Van den Enden, who was his Latin master as well as his mentor in some other respects, when he was young. So Latin would be at the center of his focus. But of course, we were interested in knowing, well, what was, when he was relaxing or reading in less difficult languages than Latin, what was his reading? Unlike his father, there's nothing in his library that's in French. Although among the majority, and certainly among his family in the Sephardic community in Amsterdam when he grew up, the spoken language, of course, was Portuguese, not Dutch. He could speak Dutch, but he didn't have a full fluency in Dutch. He admits that in one place. So he spoke Dutch, but wasn't... And actually, though there are, I think, only about 18 of the 160 books in Dutch. Apart from Latin, the 2 largest categories are his Hebrew books. Obviously, Hebrew was terribly important to Spinoza, and Spanish. I think for literary relaxation, we can see he was reading Cervantes, Luis de Góngora, Quevedo. So when he wanted a bit of literary relaxation, it was Spanish. There was nothing in his library at all in Portuguese, nothing in French, and nothing in English, and nothing in German. So we can see that he had a very specific reading schedule. A lot of other things were not part of it. Now, quite a number of writers extending from Hermann Cohen and Yitzhak was telling me earlier today, actually, that a recent book, which I haven't seen yet, by Henri Mechelon, also tends to represent, if I understood rightly, Spinoza as being in some way profoundly hostile to Jews and Judaism. So I'd like to spend just the closing part of my lecture saying something about this, because I think we should qualify that actually quite strongly. Spinoza is certainly extremely hostile to religious authority in Judaism, and he doesn't like rabbis, that's clear. He especially doesn't like rabbis when they are censoring what you're thinking or writing or reading, or being, like Yosef Shlomo del Medico, one of his main points is that the rabbis exercise a kind of censorship, a bit like, not as bad as the Inquisition, they don't arrest people and torture them and that sort of thing, but they do prevent publication of some aspects of science and other things, and that's not a good thing. And so he doesn't like religious authority within Judaism. When he's he writes several passages in his political books which are actually very favorable to the ancient Hebrew Republic, because the ancient Hebrew Republic didn't have a real aristocracy. And until King Saul was appointed king, it didn't really have a monarchy. There was a republican phase, which he's actually very rather positive about, especially as he thinks because of the way they applied religious law, everyone had to respect the same rules, and everyone kind of shared in their conception of God and their conception of society. So it was a rather egalitarian kind of agricultural society, which he seems to have rather a high regard for. I think Spinoza has a particularly high regard for the Hebrew language, and it's very clear that until another of the texts that I was going to put on the board this evening, if I can get the thing to move. Okay, there is in the that's the Amsterdam Town Hall, which was where, among other things, where Adrian Courbach was sentenced to life in prison, to 10 years in prison, as I mentioned before. Can we move it on to the Hebrew grammar? That's the synagogue that he attended as a young man before his expulsion in 1656. Yes, I wanted to show this at the close of my lecture because it's very interesting that the early biographers and those that write about Spinoza's life in his last years stress that when he'd finished, the TTP was finished, and that was published in the Tractatus Theologico-Politicus in 1670. His most important book, The Ethics, he tried to publish but couldn't, so it was left in manuscript, and his friends and allies secretively edited and published all his unpublished work, so it came out about 10 or 11 months after he died, towards the end of 1677 or beginning of 1678. But in his last years, he was mainly working again on Hebrew studies, and I think that's very, very significant. He did write, it was left unfinished, but he didn't destroy this text. It was left in manuscript, quite a long Hebrew grammar, which was tacked on at the end. His allies and friends secretively published the Ethics together with some correspondence and several unfinished texts, including this one, bundled together, which they called the Opera Posthuma. The posthumous works published in, has the date 1677 on it. And so the Hebrew grammar is a good indication of his, I think, love of Hebrew. And also at the end of his life, the Sebastian Courtauld I mentioned before says it was a translation into Latin. That's probably correct. The most important biographers, early biographers of Spinoza, Johannes Colerus, says it was into Latin. But it seems that he was that he wrote or drafted and had been discussing it with his friends. His translation of a large part, the Pentateuch, he supposedly had finished and gone on to some of the later books of the Old Testament, but that he wasn't satisfied with aspects of it, and shortly before he died, it said that he hurled all that material into the fire and destroyed it, which is probably what happened. But it's another indication of Spinoza's deep preoccupation with Scripture and with Hebrew. He thought that it was possible, perhaps the most important principle that he uses is the idea that by studying carefully the Hebrew roots, you can trace back the original meanings, and one of the examples he gives is the word nabi, or nabi for prophet, for example, which he thinks originally meant something like a messenger or announcer. It didn't have the ring that was given to it later, with the supernatural elements that were given to it later. But let me just finish by saying that Spinoza writes quite extensively about the divisions that came about in the Hellenistic period in the Jewish world, the divisions of the Jews into Sadducees, into Pharisees, into Essenes. He doesn't say much about Essenes, but he talks about the different sects and the Zealots at the time of the Great Jewish Revolt against Rome. And he obviously thinks that he thinks the Pharisees were a superstitious lot and has a very negative opinion of them. But he thinks that there were other Jewish and Hebrew traditions that he's much more sympathetic to. He speaks quite favorably of the Sadducees, for example. And I think that to say that of course, the idea of the secular Jew didn't really exist at that time, although Spinoza's thought is one of the main creative elements that went into the making of the idea of the modern secular Jew. To say that Spinoza was in some sense profoundly hostile to Jews and Judaism, I mean, he did certainly insist that the Jews were not specially elected by God, that the Jews are just one people alongside all the other peoples, that there's nothing different or special about the Jews as a people. They are simply one people among all the others, but therefore equal to the other peoples. And he didn't believe that any individual or any people can be specially elected by God, because nobody can be specially elected by God. But I don't think it is correct so he's hostile to rabbinic authority as it operated at that time. But to say, as some have, that he was profoundly hostile to Jews and Judaism as such, I don't think that that is really correct. And I do think that although Jewish enlightenment is really a parallel to the general enlightenment in the sense that there is a moderate Jewish enlightenment, of which Moses Mendelssohn in the later 18th century is the great representative, who obeyed all those three rules I mentioned before. You don't attack basic core religious doctrine, you don't reject kings, you don't reject aristocracy, therefore that's moderate enlightenment. But there was always, even in, I think, not just in Spinoza's wake, something that he influenced, so that later people like Solomon Maimon, for example, could be classified as being part of this, at least to some extent, part of this radical tradition, and many others that came later, Heinrich Heine and Moses Hess, obviously, in the early 19th century. But I do think that in Spinoza's own lifetime, we can see that after the Cherem, after the expulsion of 1656, he continued having conversations and discussions, whilst he was still living in Amsterdam, down to 1660, with Jews who were not so observant. We know that a couple of those, we know this from detailed reports that were given to the Inquisition about this in Spain, in Madrid, in 1658, but one by a friar and another report by a Spanish army officer who had been stuck for a few months in Amsterdam, and also went to this chat club in the home of a Canary Island merchant who was ill, a man called Joseph Guerra, and they had these long discussions, which rather horrified the friar and the Spanish infantry officer, but they were a small minority there because most of the other Spanish speakers who gathered at this club were Sephardic Jews, several from Seville and several from Cordoba. And a couple of them went to synagogue each Saturday and were observant, but that didn't stop them having conversations, which, of course, you're not supposed to do after the excommunication, or the Cherem, of 1656, including one, a man called Miguel Reynoso, who was a physician, who was actually been a panas, so he was part of the authority structure of the synagogue, but even he continued having discussions with Spinoza. But there were a couple of others. I won't go into Daniel Ribera, I'm quite interested in him. And Juan de Prado, a very well-known Sephardic free thinker who had only arrived from Spain a year or two before, in 1655, who represents, so let me finish with this point, there is a tradition which is very intimately connected with the Inquisition, which is Jewish to a large extent, but it's by no means exclusively Jewish. That's the important thing about it, which links with radical enlightenment in a very important way. I once went to a seminar about this in Basel, in Switzerland, which is extremely interesting, held by specialists in Spanish literature. And they were talking about how, if you live in a society which has religious oppression to that extent, like the Inquisition did in Spain, it almost automatically is going to generate, especially among university students in whether it's in Salamanca or Cordoba or Alcalá de Henares in Spain or Coimbra in Portugal. That's what happened to Uriel da Costa. He became a free thinker in exactly that way. The church tells you these doctrines are absolutely true, no one's allowed to doubt them. Then you start reading things about the early history of Christianity, and you think, really? What? Where did they get that from? And you get more and more doubts. And then you start thinking to yourself, you read the New Testament again, yeah, a lot of this seems pretty bogus. And the feeling that it was becomes quite strong among these underground, partly crypto-Jewish, but partly just free-thinking circles that had, as with Uriel da Costa or Juan de Prado, become free thinkers. They cast off the crypto-Judaism, which is no longer really part of their outlook. And it was oppression itself, the ferocity, the extreme oppression of the Inquisition, the way it tortured and burnt to death so many and so publicly, that was the very thing that stimulated this underground movement and made it extremely hostile to church authority. Although it's hostile to Christian doctrine in all respects, this underground movement, it's when you get onto the bishops and the papacy, church organization, church authority, they're not like rabbis. They're not hostile to church institutions and church structures and church practices in the sort of respectful, timid way that rabbis would be through the same. These guys, they're ferocious. They're as ferocious as the inquisitors when they're discussing the churches and the bishops. And I think a lot of this tendency in Spinoza is part of the cultural background that gave rise to his philosophy. So there is such a thing, I think, as a Jewish angle to the Western world's radical enlightenment. The radical enlightenment had to stay largely hidden to the late 18th century, though it comes more and more out into the open in the late 18th century with the American Revolution and then with the French Revolution, and becomes a major factor in a complicated story, of course, in the creating of modernity. And it is part of the Western world's shift towards modern ideas of society and democratic republicanism in general. So it's a general Western tendency and phenomenon. But it does have a Jewish angle to it, and that angle at its root is Iberian and connected with the Inquisition and connected with these groups that Spinoza knew as a young person. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Jonathan. We are going to keep that questions from the audience to later on. So keep your questions. If you will have a chance to discuss with the panel. So we are moving forward actually now directly to the music part and the short intermission, after which you will listen to Yitzhak Melamed, and Jonathan will be back with us on stage. Thank you very much. I'm very, very happy to be able to present for you two fabulous violinists, Anders Shelbert Nilsson and Victoria Sales, and they will perform violin duos from Leclerc. One duo, and one later on after the intermission. So Anders and Victoria, please take the stage. Thank you.
We'll be playing one movement from the C major sonata of Jean-Marie Leclerc, French composer of the Baroque period. Yeah.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. We are ready to proceed with the second part of our seminar. And I am very happy to present Yitzhak Melamed. Yitzhak Melamed, it depends on how you say it, in Yiddish, in Hebrew. Melamed, yeah. Israeli-born American scholar from Johns Hopkins University, professor of philosophy. Please.
Thank you so much, Lizzie. Good evening, and I would like first to thank Lizzie and Professor Heinz Rühn for the very generous invitation. It's my honor to be here today. I'm going to speak about one event in Spinoza's life. To be honest, I mean, for the past of my work itself, I dedicated mostly to the metaphysics and the philosophy of Spinoza, but there is one event. It happens in July 1656, as Spinoza is precisely 24 years old, which many people, many scholars see as just creating a divide in his life. It's the event in which he was put on a cherem, some sort of a ban. And my claim in this talk will be that we don't really know what happened. I mean, I think that there are plenty of legends about it, because Spinoza became some sort of a saint, if you wish, of the Enlightenment. So just like any kind of saint, you will have a geography around that person, and there are so many stories about what really happened in the harem, etc. Many of them are really just nice fairy tales. Now, what I would like to do, I'll do my best to finish in 25 minutes. Let's see if I'm able to do that. So I'll first of all tell you just what is this kind of basic legend about the harem on Spinoza, what happened, I mean, what the common story is. Then we will read together the most significant evidence about what happened there, which is the actual text of the harem, what precisely is said there. Then I'll discuss three common explanations for the reasons for the harem. I think all three of them are not really likely. Actually, I think that most of them are just extremely unlikely. And I'm not going to solve the problem. I'm just going to give you more troubles. I will finish with just some suggestions about Spinoza's himself, Spinoza's own attitude to the notion of excommunication, and perhaps even some small hesitation about, is it always wrong? Is the use of bans always wrong? My claim is not. I mean, sometimes there is it's right to use a ban in a certain way. So, but we have lots to cover. So let me start with part one. So during the 18th and I'm sorry. I need to remember moving. Sorry. So okay. So I'll have to remember moving. So during the 18th and 19th century, the story of Spinoza's excommunication was frequently cited by European writers as a proof of the cultural inferiority and backwardness of the Jews and the rabbis. So here's just one example, one quote which you can have here from Hegel. Hegel is very fond of Spinoza. So here's the text. In his youth, Spinoza was instructed by the rabbis of the synagogue to which he belonged, but he soon felt put with them, their wrath having been kindled by the criticism which he has passed on the fantastic doctrines of the Talmud. The rabbis offered to him a yearly allowance of 1,000 gulden if he would keep away from the synagogue and hold his tongue. This offer has been declined, and the rabbis thereafter carried their persecution of him to such a pitch that they were minded to rid themselves of him by assassination. Now, assassination or not, I don't know. It's actually, I would not reject this possibility, but the question which interests me is precisely why did that happen? Now, there were two recent historical plays about the biography and the figure of Spinoza playing the story of the excommunication, and both of them were basically telling the story in slightly different terms. So one play, which was staged in Israel about, 33 years ago by a playwright named Yoshua Sobol, charges the rabbis, rather than the Jews in general, with fanaticism and intolerance. In many ways, Spinoza is a kind of a mirror for the identity of some of the figure writers. They are using Spinoza in order to say something about themselves, about their own period. So I think that if any of you had the chance to read this play, I think you could witness it yourself. Then 18 years later, we have David Yves, New Jerusalem, places the guilt on the Amsterdam city authorities, who are described as pressing the Jewish community to cast out the damned heretic. So here in New Jerusalem, you have some sort of a PC version. The narrative of both plays are highly ideological and have much more to do with the political reality of the playwright at that time, meaning either in 1991 or 2009, rather than with that of Spinoza, rather than with the life of Spinoza. Now, the core of the popular narrative of Spinoza's excommunication is roughly something like that. Spinoza was banned by the rabbi due to his heretical espousal of atheism or pantheism and his denial of the eternity of the human mind. So I think that you find these kind of versions throughout the past 3 centuries. Just I'll stress again, we are now in, so the Cherem was in 1656. We are about 3.5 centuries after that. And arguably, we still don't know what happened there. And people were working. It's not that, I mean, ask Jonathan. I mean, people are trying to find documents. We still do not really understand. We have one important document, which we are going to read together, but we still really don't understand. It's quite amazing. I mean, after 3.5 centuries, we are still wondering what precisely happened there. Okay. So here's the text which is most important for us. It's the text itself of the Cherem. Let's read it together. So that's the seniors of the Ma'amad. The Ma'amad is the lay leadership of the community in Amsterdam. It's, if I'm not mistaken, 6 people. They are the leaders of the community in Amsterdam. The rabbis are subservient to them. I mean, they are going to, so at some point, just to give you a nice anecdote about the division of authority in the Amsterdam Jewish community at the time, one of the rabbis, by the name of Menashe ben Israel, was arguing that the authority to launch a cherem or excommunication should be invested with the rabbis, not with the lay leadership. And the lay leadership told him, no, we are the leaders, I mean, keep quiet. How do you think this issue was resolved? Well, very simply. The rabbi, Menashe ben Israel, was himself put on cherem for 1 day. He repented. That's the end of the story. So the authority about announcing cherem, again, was invested not with the rabbis. I mean, they would have to give their agreement of sorts, but still, it's an act of the lay leadership. So that's why we are saying it here, saying the seniors of the Ma'amad, having long known the evil opinions and acts. Now, I think that's something important that we should stress. It's a combination of opinions and acts, right? Something that should bring both of them together. Of Baruch de Spinoza, they have endeavored by various means and promises to turn him from his evil ways, but having failed to make him mend his wicked ways, and on the contrary, daily receiving more and more serious information about the abominable heresies which he practiced and taught. So again, there are heresies. He's practicing. How do you practice a heresy, right? I mean, what's precisely is going on there? And taught, and his monstrous deeds. Again, so some actions, monstrous deeds. and having for his numerous trustworthy witnesses who have deposed and borne witness to this effect in the presence of the said Spinoza, so there was some inquiry going on, they have become convinced of the truth of this matter, and after all this has been investigated in the presence of the honorable Chachamim, meaning the rabbis, they have decided with their consent, meaning with the consent of the rabbis, that the said Spinoza would be placed under herem and separate from the nation of Israel. And what happens next is just a formula. It's a magical formula that is placing on Spinoza. That's what herem is, by the way. I mean, by its nature, the herem is mostly a kind of a magical formula, because that's what kind of power would a community, minority community like the Jewish community would have in order to enforce agreement within the community? Usually it was basically the herem. They could not do anything else. I mean, they could try to find people. If people are not going to accept the fine, then you need to have some sort, and the greatest power you can have is just to threaten someone with a magical power, and that's precisely what is happening in the, I'm sorry, I forgot to, so let's see, oops. So here you have the whole formula. Many curses, right? Now, you might be impressed by these many curses, but just to spoil the party, I can tell you that that's only a short version. Spinoza was pretty, I mean, the full version, which we have in a text from the 14th century, is about 20 times longer. It's much more poetic. Basically telling you, you are cursed in this and you are cursed in that. You are cursed in this. Again, it's a magic. It needs to work. And therefore, you have a very heavy, but just to make things clear, every word in this curse that is used against Spinoza is documented in the text that we have already from the 14th century. We don't have a good history of the use of herem. Actually, we don't also have a good history of the theory of herem in Jewish communities, which might indicate, I'm not sure, which might indicate that it was not very common. The only thing which we do know is that the Amsterdam Jewish community in the 17th century was the world capital, both in space and time, for harems. So generally, in this community, in something like 20 years, you would have more instances of harem than you will have in most communities in 2 millennia. Just to give you an example, when we try to look at the so-called Cairo Gniza, which give you documentation of almost 2,000 years of Jewish history and documents and all this huge amount of material, how many rites of harem do we find there? Any idea? Zero. Simply zero. So we don't know, we don't have a good history of the harem. I think it doesn't mean, again, we need a history, and I think it should be done at some point. But one of the things that which of course will immediately come to mind once we are addressing this kind of event in the case of Spinoza is, well, okay, but what happened? Why did this happen? So let's discuss a few general characteristics of what was going on. So the Cherem was pronounced on the 6th day of Av, the Hebrew month of Av, 1656. When I wrote, I mean, it's most probably Thursday. I mean, the same day, the same Hebrew day begins already on Wednesday night, but because in Amsterdam, July is going to, I mean, the night in July will begin very, very late. It's extremely unlikely that you'll have a meeting something like 11 o'clock at night or something like that. So I would mostly presume that the event took place on Thursday, July 27th. The Cherem was announced by the lay leaders, not their rabbinic court and not the rabbis. The reason for the Cherem, and again, that's just simply trying to stick to the words, was a combination of monstrous deeds and abominable heresies. Spinoza taught the abominable heresies, so there is here, I think you can see the threat of someone basically propagating some views and ideas. However, the nature of the deeds and heresies is not spelled out in the document, and you ask why? Why not basically saying, if we are afraid of him as an atheist, why someone is not saying, oh, he was saying such and such? Nothing. We don't know. Now, I mentioned that some scholars were highly impressed by the severity of the text rhetoric. I'm going to skip that. I mean, well, I don't know. Should I skip? Or I can do it very quickly. So Stephen Nadler is making the claim that the text itself was partly composed by Leo Modena, which is not true. I mean, again, every word in this text is a precise translation, 100% precise translation for 14th century text. So I wouldn't be impressed by the severity of the text because, again, it's not genuine. It's a formula that existed at least 3 centuries. There is a good chance much longer. Then, again, I'm going to skip. So Jonathan mentioned the testimony, super interesting testimony of a monk and a sailor before the Inquisition that might be, we might use it in order to understand what was happening in this event, but we won't have much time for that, so I'll skip that. So let me try to go straight to the question of why was he put on cherem? So the most common explanation that you'll find, I think, in most books is that because Spinoza was an atheist or a pantheist. Now, I'll put aside the atheism question because in many ways, I mean, the first part of the ethics is called the Deo, on God. Actually, there is a huge amount of discussion of God, and it's extremely original. It has a proof of the existence of God, which is better than any proof, similar proof that you find in previous philosophers, and it's extremely ingenious. I mean, he's not basically doing just cut and paste from Descartes or from other medieval philosophers. He's devising his own proof of the existence of God, of his understanding of a specific God, a very non-anthropomorphic God, a God that is not a person. So I'm not going to discuss the suggestion of atheism, although if it comes up, I'll be happy to address that. But the question is whether it's possible that Spinoza was banned because he was a pantheist, and he was indeed a pantheist or panentheist. And in the 17th century, pantheism was widely perceived as a dangerous heresy in the early modern Latin West, but, and I'll stress that it did not have that reputation in the rabbinic context, in the Jewish context. In fact, pantheism is the mainstream of the Kabbalistic thought. So you will find statements like God is nature all over Kabbalistic literature. As it happens, the Hebrew word for God, Elohim, and the Hebrew word for nature, Teva, happen to have the precise numerical value. And then you have dozens of Kabbalists saying, God is nature, of course God is nature. There's no question about that. So it's almost taken as a pious basic doctrine of Kabbalism or of Judaism. The mainstream of the Kabbalah in that sense is thoroughly panentheistic, and most of Spinoza's teachers, so I would say literally almost, so if we consider, for example, Charles Mortera, who was involved probably in the Cherem as far as we know, they affirmed various versions of panentheism. So, for example, Mortera would say that God is the place of the world, meaning the world inheres in God. Now, how far will the Kabbalists go with this claim that everything is divine? As far as you wish. Some of them will tell you, again, we're not going, don't tell it out loud, but they will tell you, whenever you eat something, you eat God, you eat bits of God, because God is everywhere. Some of them will go even further, will tell you, if you think that if you think about idolatry, and if you think that the problem with idolatry is the belief that the idol is divine, you should reconsider, Because in fact, the idol is divine. The problem with idolatry is that you think that the space to the left and to the right, to the up and to the down of the idol is not divine. Okay? So panentheism in that version, pantheism or panentheism in that version are extremely common. I mean, you have a minority view in the Kabbalistic thought that will reject that, but for the most part, that's almost the official doctrine. Not almost, that's the official doctrine. And that's actually quite unusual because Kabbalists were fighting with each other all over the time. They have disagreements on almost anything. On the issue of whether God is everywhere, it's almost like, you know, you have a small group of, we can call them Gnostic or dualistic Kabbalists. We know about them. They are a minority. So is it likely that he was banned then because he was a pantheist? Well, yeah, if you, that would, you know, it's almost like saying that you will ban someone because he's wearing trousers. So if the rabbis of Spinoza, if the leaders of the community are pantheists themselves, how are they going to ban Spinoza because he was a pantheist, right? I mean, that seems to be, again, it's a view that is all over. Another suggestion that was made by some scholars, two scholars specifically, Kasher and Biderman, I'll do my best to move faster. So that Spinoza was excommunicated because he had been interested in Cartesian philosophy and expressed this philosophical inclination in public. These are two Israeli scholars that are basically trying to read both medieval and some 20th century stories into the story of Spinoza, because we know that there was criticism of philosophy within medieval Jewish philosophy, and there is there is a fear that philosophy within rabbinic Judaism, there was a fear that philosophy leads to heresy, something like that. Is that true also about what is going on in Amsterdam? Well, the answer is straight no. When you look at the libraries of the figures who put a cherem on Spinoza, you'll find there a very nice collection of Averroist philosophy. One of the rabbis is Yitzhak Abuav. His library includes the works of Aristotle, Averroes, Ibn Ezra, Maimonides' Guide, Gersonides, Words of the Lord. Basically, a very nice collection of a radical medieval Jewish philosophy. These are not figures that, at least on the face of it, will be afraid of the study of philosophy. And in another case, we know that, for example, Menashe ben Israel is described by one of his teachers, Avraham Cohen Herrera, as a great philosopher, right? Theologian and philosopher. So if your rabbi is describing you as a philosopher, in a sense, as a praise, that does not seem to be a community where any discussion of philosophy would be considered to be something extremely dangerous. So there are some other reasons that I would throw out this suggestion, but I'll skip those because in considerations of time. So what about the other third possibility, denial of immortality? And that's a suggestion that was made by Stephen Nadler. It is true that for Spinoza there is no point in speaking about afterlife. I will here in brackets say that I think that for Spinoza it's not only that afterlife is a myth. I'll say one sentence. I think for Spinoza the notion of death itself is partly a myth. I mean, the notion of death is the construct of our imagination, of our fears, and of our description of a certain event by our fears and intentions about this event. He thinks that once you have a proper understanding of what exists, you will have a different attitude towards death and towards your own death. So for Spinoza, afterlife will be just a pile of nonsense. I mean, first of all, you have the fear of death as constituting your understanding of death, and then you have a kind of compensation for that, which is the story of afterlife, and he will say, oh, sorry, the problem is not there, and your solution is just a nice fairy tale. So Having said that, I have to say that Spinoza does commit himself to a view that there is a sense in which the human mind exists eternally, but again, it's not only the human mind. There is some sort of existence which we all share and almost get it for free. And the interesting thing is that this view was also embraced by medieval Jewish Averroists from Maimonides onwards. And Spinoza is not only aware of that, he's playing with this word, he's playing with these slogans in the end of in the last part of the Ethics. So, either he is perhaps trying to pretend that he is a Jewish Averroist, but I doubt it, because I don't think that he cannot assume that his readers are going to be familiar with the medieval Jewish Averroism, with all its perception, with its understanding of unification with the agent intellect. Or what I take to be much more reasonable conclusion is that that was pretty close to his own views, meaning that yes, you exist, you have a sense of eternity because in some sense, I think for Spinoza, duration itself is a kind of existence that is secondary to what is truly exists, which is eternity. Now, so I think for that reason, and for a few other ones, I'll just, wait a minute. Sorry. So I think for that reason, and for you other ones, I don't think it's likely that he was put on a ban or cherem because of his denial of mind eternity. Just to quickly point out these 2 points, I mean, first of all, bans related to mere dogma are extremely uncommon within Rabbinic Judaism. I mean, you have to find them. There are very few, if any. The last point is that you remember that we were talking about combination of deeds and heresies, a combination of what kind of deeds can you have with regard to life eternal, with regard to afterlife. I mean, what did he do? I mean, did he deny someone that was trying to raise the dead? I don't know. I mean, but I don't see anything that is, or at least I'm not aware. It seems to be that we need if there is much that, we'll need an explanation about what precisely was going on there. Okay, so none of these explanations is going to work. I have a pet theory about what happened there, but I'll keep it for the Q&A because I don't want to take too much of your time. So let me just make 2 last points so that you'll keep thinking about it. So here's one surprise. You would think that Spinoza himself would be against herems and against excommunications. That's not the case. So here's the view that a claim that he's making at the end of his Theological Political Treatise, chapter 19, and the context of the discussion is the authorities of the church, right? What kind of functions and what kind of authority the church should have. Now, Spinoza is afraid of the church. Just as Jonathan pointed out, he's afraid of rabbis and religious authorities, and he wants the state to govern them, to control them. And so he thinks that any kind of church function should be supervised by the state. In this context, Spinoza also mentions what are the main church functions, and then he repeats all of these should be supervised by the state. So here's the list. I'll read it together with you briefly. Without the authority of the permission of the supreme powers, namely the sovereign, no one has the right and power to administer these things, sacred matters, and now he's giving you a list of them, to choose their ministers, to determine and stabilize the foundation of the church and its teaching, to judge concerning morals and acts of piety, okay, to excommunicate someone, form or receive someone into the church, or finally to provide for the poor. So excommunication is precisely on the same footing as almsgiving, right? It is a legitimate function of the church. Just like everything that is done by the church, including almsgiving, should be supervised by the state because it can be manipulated by the church. Okay? So, as it turned out, for Spinoza, he undergone something similar to that. He's not that much against it or does not have any kind of an in-principle objection. Let me finish just with one last thought about the use of bans and harems. And excommunication in Roman Catholicism was, many cases, was abused. In some cases, it was used properly, meaning, so it could have been used, and it was used sometimes for well-justified ends, such as the prohibition of polygamy and participation in duels. So that's at least, I'm not a social historian, but one of the explanations for the difference in terms of the frequency of duels between South and North Germany in the 18th and 18th century was that the strong fight against them and the use of excommunication against the participants in duels that you find in South Germany. Is that historically true? I don't know, but I'm saying that's one of the common historical explanations. I think that also today we are using bans, and it's absolutely right to do them. So bans or boycotts were used positively and responsibly in the fight against South African apartheid and in the attempt to counter the power of the tobacco and gun industries, and I think that's absolutely justified. Now, we should recognize that a ban is a semi-violent political tool, right? It is powerful and subject to abuse, just like any political measure. But we're doing things which are far worse than that. We're placing people in prison, which is, I'm not sure, I hope that a few centuries from now people will laugh at us or perhaps will spare us for this kind of attitude. In some forms, the politically sanctioned practice of banning or public shaming may perhaps be useful as an alternative to incarceration. So where would it end? Well, again, there was an event. There was a harem. Harems are powerful political tools, and most likely they were abused in the case of Spinoza. What was the reason for that? Frankly, we don't know. It's a combination of certain heresies and things that he has done. But again, what precisely they were, we need documents. Thank you.
So we'll continue with music by Leclerc, and this is the Cabot and the Presto from the sonata in E minor.
So thank you very much again, both of you. And Yitzhak, you have now placed us on hold as to the real explanation, but we will, I'm sure, give you an opportunity to come back to that. And I suspect that Jonathan also has something to say about this controversial issue about the ban or the harem. But I'd like to start now by introducing our third guest, Karin Franzén, whom, as I said initially, is professor in comparative literature at Stockholm University and who has specialized a great deal in the women libertine writers of the 17th and early 18th century. And the particular, also, you will say something about the Spinozist legacy operating through this. So I will give the word to you and to present some of your ideas, and then we'll have a discussion. Please.
Okay, thank you, Hans, and thank you, Isak and Jonathan, for very inspiring presentations. As Hans said, I have worked on the French free-thinking movement, which developed from Montaigne and continued in the 17th century with lots of parallels with Spinoza's thinking. I think that you could say that, the radical enlightenment, to use Jonathan's term, started also in the free-thinking circles in Paris in the mid-17th century. And actually, there was, I think you can talk about kind of alternative philosophical movement to Cartesian Descartes' philosophy. Of course, Descartes could be said to be, one of the ground or the foundation for modern enlightenment or the modernity, to say it simply. But at the same time, he was questioned by this kind of free-thinking movement who doubted in some ways the power of reason. And of course, Spinoza didn't doubt the power of reason, but he questioned the centrality of the human being. And that, I think, it's a kind of... I was so impressed by reading your article about Spinoza's anti-humanism. And I saw so many parallels between the free-thinking movement following in the wake of Montaigne's essay, where Montaigne could write something like, "Presumption is our natural and original malady. The most vulnerable and frail of all creature is man, and at the same time the most arrogant." And I think that it's something that could be articulated also in Spinoza. Yes. He doesn't use these words, but so I'm so struck by these parallels. And also some of these free thinkers or libertines who also, of course, had to act, to practice their thinking and writing and so on under camouflage, also to dissimulate what they were thinking. It was, well, they shared this kind of, you said, they were very careful not to be too explicit, and they developed a very subtle way of speaking between the lines and so on. But many of them, or some of them perhaps, visited also Spinoza before he became this kind of hero or great thinker, when he was still a kind of, well, subterranean, subversive person that you couldn't talk about, as you said, Jonathan. And I think that's interesting to think of these kinds of traffic between, even though Spinoza didn't have French literature in his library, I think it's very interesting to think about this kind of traffic between Paris and Holland. And also, they visited Spinoza, and then they came back to Paris, and they discussed very, I think, Spinozist thoughts in the saloons in Paris, materialist thoughts about there is no division between mind and body, for example, which was the Cartesian, the big Cartesian thesis, and there is no great clash or division between man and animals, which was also the Cartesian idea of the animal machine, for example. And I would like you to say something about this connection, because it's so under-researched. Is it a myth? Is it an anecdote without founding? Or is there really parallels and connection between this French free thinking? You talked about the Spanish free thinking groups and circles, but I found so many parallels, and especially in one woman poet who was a great poet in the 17th century, but she felt out of canon, as many of the early modern women writers did. Her name was Antoinette Dessoulières, and she opened one of the first and the most famous libertine saloons. And to be a libertine is to be a free thinker in the 17th century. It has not so much to do with sexual freedom and so on. Very little, I should say. But they discussed Spinozist idea, and she takes them in her poetry. And I think that Bayle, he said, Henri Bayle, great Enlightenment philosopher, he said about her that one of the most spiritual person in Paris prefers the condition of sheep to that of man. So in her idyll, she talks about sheep and other natural phenomena in a way that sounds very Spinozist to my ears. So the first one is perhaps the anti-humanist track, if you would like to develop that a little bit. And the other one is perhaps for you, Jonathan, about the intellectual gunpowder that Spinoza possibly could have given to the French free-thinking movement.
Thank you. So let me first say that just like Jonathan, I think that Spinoza is a radical. A radical in both in the sense that he is just going to the roots. He's not making compromises and just usually he's going to the root. There are some cases where he's a human being, but a lot of times, I mean, he's able to do something profound and deep and even challenge the most common sense assumptions that almost everyone will share, and he will say, no, forget about it. I'm not part of that. Again, sometimes he's not. I mean, the case of women, I mean, is one of the interesting cases where, you know, you see him also just saying, sticking with the stupid prejudice without being able to challenge it. But let's go to the issue of humanism. And I think that in some sense, Spinoza created I would argue, the greatest revolution in modern philosophy that was not appreciated. I mean, he is the person who would basically tell you, I mean, listen, what you have right now is a cult of humanity. It's a cult of humanity both in terms of actual religion, where your God is just a human being, a superhuman being, or something like that. It's a God with just all the ens perfectissimo. It's just take all the perfections of humanity, double them infinitely or whatever, and then you have God, something like that. And Spinoza will say, good, nice. I mean, it's what is it? I mean, you're just having involved in a cult of
a person, God is a person.
Yeah, of course. I mean, and
the human being.
The funny and the interesting thing is that the whole Enlightenment movement, just almost without any exceptions, are part of this cult, Kant included. Right? I mean, Locke, Kant,
and Descartes, yes, of course. Yeah.
I mean, and you know, even Kant will tell you that you cannot know God, but you should have a rational faith in a benevolent God that will eventually give you reward and afterlife, or something like that, as a moral postulate, right? I mean, that's Spinoza will tell you, forget about all of this. I mean, he has a concept of God, but he's fighting against any ascription of any kind of human characteristics to the God. And as far as I can see, I mean, his problem with traditional religion is not so much with the concept of God, but with the view of God as a Superman. Right? But next to that, he has also a very radical view about the fact that we don't have this so-called freedom of the will, because freedom of the will for Spinoza is just a miracle. And in the same way that he thinks that other kinds of miracles are nice fairy tales, he'll tell you any belief in a freedom of the will is just a belief in a miracle that appears every second. Good for you, but he'll tell you, I'm not part of that as well.
And Descartes, he thinks that the freedom of the will makes you like God.
Of course.
Yeah, that's...
Of course.
And different from animals.
Yeah, and different from animals, of course.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I also think that
well.
what you write about freedom in that article about Spinoza's anti-humanism is also very interesting in regard to the free-thinking movement, but also perhaps for our concerns today, and environmental concerns, because he states that there is a freedom, the freedom to follow nature, to nature, the material, the movement of the material is in, the freedom is inherent in that movement if you can follow it. But if you want to master it, if you want to control it, then you don't have freedom. It's a kind of, I don't know. Yeah, that's a thought you can find in the free-thinking tradition, perhaps. But is it, yeah?
No, I think that's right. I mean, he has a notion of freedom as self-determination. In many ways, I think that of all the modern philosophers who are developing this notion of freedom, self-determination, he's really the beginning that in... I won't say that you won't have it before him, but I think that his impact is extremely important. For example, on the influence of Fichte and figures like that. But what he's not willing to do is say, I'm not going to take part in the myth of humanity. and I'm not going to take part in this cult. Now, it doesn't mean that he's not a misanthrope. And the book is about, the ethics is about human beings. It's about the salvation, or it's about the proper life for human beings. But the condition for that is a proper understanding of the conditions of humanity without fairy tales. And one of the impressive things about his philosophy is that he is devising a very, and here I became more and more in agreement with Jonathan, I think he's suggesting a progressive political philosophy. I was less of that view 10, 15 years ago, I would say, but I think that he is trying to find a way for human political liberation, still without illusions, without basically telling you that you have any kind of powers that you don't have, without thinking that I'm going to give you a right, and in the name of this abstract right, without any kind of conditions that will allow you to practice this right, it will give you anything. So he's a super realist in terms of just recognition of what power can do and what you cannot do without power. But on the other hand, he's really thinking hard about how to create a society in which we do not abuse each other.
Yeah. So I think that Spinoza's naturalism has a lot to say to our environmental concern today.
Yeah,
actually. Yeah. But now, if you go back to the connection, I know you have researched a lot about who visited Spinoza, and was it really kind of traffic, or is it an anecdote that you find in Bale?
No. I think I mentioned that he didn't seem to read French, which is odd in a way, because his father knew French much better than Dutch and had been brought up in Nantes, the west of France. But we do, I assume, first of all, he obviously had no trouble reading Italian, though he didn't read it much, because his copy of Machiavelli is in the Italian original, so I think that was not a problem for him. I don't think French was, he just wasn't in the habit of reading French, but we know that he had conversations with Saint-Evremont, for example, who was a great example of a French libertine writer, who found it quite intriguing. He was one of the people, Saint-Evremont says this, that he found most interesting to have discussions with in The Hague, although perhaps he misread Spinoza in certain respects because of Spinoza's caution and not saying certain things too much in conversation. We know also that Spinoza, during his visit to Utrecht in 1673, which has exercised this intellectual historians quite a lot, what was he doing there, what was that about? But the expedition to Utrecht in the middle of a war with the French occupying Utrecht could be regarded as from different points of view. But one thing that is absolutely certain, and no one can question, is that whilst he was in Utrecht, he had a lot of discussions with French officers, who I assume their Latin wasn't very good in most cases. And it seems to me clear proof. We don't really know when Leibniz, for example, came to have discussions with Spinoza in 1676, whether they were talking in French or Latin seems to me somewhat open to doubt. But I don't see how you can doubt that when he was in Utrecht having discussions with a number of well-known French officers, and this is recorded in several different sources, that he must have been talking in French, because they couldn't speak Dutch and they couldn't speak Latin.
No, of course.
So, and I don't think I don't know whether Saint-Evremont was a good Latinist, but I assume their discussions were in fact in French. And he had other French followers we know, like Saint-Blanc and Lucas and so on. So I think that Spinoza was quite at home in discussing in French, and it's quite clear that at a very early stage, some quite high up French freethinkers who were members of the nobility or members of the court, like the Duchess Sophia in Heidelberg, who was more used to writing and reading in French than in German, though you could technically call her German, but she counted as a French, very witty and very knowledgeable lady in the late 17th century, had a very favorable view of Spinoza. And she was one of the ones, and I think there are a number of people like this among the French libertine community, let's call it, in Europe, who were diffusing Spinoza's ideas through their discussions.
I think that kind of network still has to be discovered.
More should be.
I think so.
That, yes.
Yeah. So. Do you want to?
Thank you. Yeah, I have several questions, and hopefully we can also have a few minutes for maybe some questions from the audience. But I wanted both of you to reflect separately on one paradox that I think strikes anyone who starts reading and trying to understand Spinoza, has to do precisely with this relation to freedom. As you mentioned, Yitzhak, just now, Spinoza has a very strong argument against the freedom of the will, as almost like a myth. We think we are acting out of our will, but we are really performing something that has to do with our nature. And he makes this point, he really stresses this point, that freedom in the conventional sense is sort of a myth. But on the other hand, it's clear from both of your talk, especially your talk, Jonathan, and the general reception of Spinoza, there is perhaps no other thinker who has had a more profound impact on the sense of freedom as both political and ethical freedom. Yes. Spinoza is the freedom thinker par excellence. So how can you be the freedom thinker and at the same time negate the possibility of free will? And I'm sure you have slightly different views on this. So I would like you to hear the shorthand version of your answer to this famous paradox.
Actually, I don't disagree with a single word that Yitzhak just said, but I'd put the emphasis slightly differently, I think. A good parallel would be actually Spinoza's view of God. God can't alter the laws of nature, and there's a sense in which God is determined too. The laws of nature are God. God can't depart from those and decide to do something different tomorrow. But he's still free because nothing constrains God, and he only follows the laws which determine him. Now, Spinoza thinks that most humans have a conception of freedom of the will, which is a total myth and fairy tale, just as Yitzhak has said, and we don't have that kind of freedom. But we have to understand that we have inner drives and outer constraints, a mixture of things which determine human behavior. And the more ignorant you are, and the more misguided your ideas are, the more likely you are to be controlled by a combination of outside constraints, which you think are proper and right, that you should be doing this, maybe bowing to some terrible tyrant, for example, but also inner appetites. He gives many examples. He talks about chatterboxes who think they're acting out of freedom of the will by chattering all the time to different people, but they're really being driven by some kind of inner problem that they haven't overcome. Or he talks about a drunkard. A drunkard is quite likely to think that it is by his free choice that he goes to the pub every evening and drinks 3 times as much beer or whatever it is, spirits, as are good for him. But Spinoza says, no, that's another form of bondage.
Slavery, yeah.
And slavery. So what human freedom is recognizing the mixture of drives and constraints and instincts that we have. And through our knowledge and understanding, and the more knowledge and understanding you have, the more likely you are to be able to judge rather than misjudge your own behavior and other people's, and therefore stabilize and govern your behavior in the best way that humans are capable of. And that's what he calls freedom. The trouble with this freedom is that you need to be something of a philosopher. You need to be one of the wise to be free in that sense. And there's very interesting criticism of Spinoza by one of those that knew him best at an earlier stage in the 1660s, this Danish philosopher Nicholas Steno, who I was hoping we would return to just for a moment, who says in one point, Steno later converted to Catholicism, and I mentioned he became a high ecclesiastic. And he says at one point, it's not just Spinoza, I know the pals and friends of this guy. I'm familiar with, I know the whole thing. In fact, I visited one not long ago, he says, and he was surrounded by glasses of wine and beer, and which exactly confirms me in my thing. These guys, they think that they have a kind of intellectual arrogance. They say that only the wise can be free, and then they are doing something which really condemns you might be an illiterate and uneducated person who knows practically nothing, not really through any fault of your own? And aren't they simply just arrogantly ignoring these people? There has to be a path to blessedness for the man who doesn't know, or the woman who doesn't know anything as well. Although I think Spinoza tries to answer this question by this talk about the Spirit of Christ. There is a true religion which everyone has access to. And you know that through justice and charity, you can reach it. So you may be illiterate and you may be completely ignorant and incapable of learning any philosophy, but you can still control those appetites, not be a bully and be a better sort of person through an instinctive understanding of charity and justice. So I think that both the determinism and the freedom do indeed go together in Spinoza. And just as you said, he is the great philosopher of freedom, despite the emphasis on everything we do being determined.
Yitzhak, now you developed shortly the argument about the more metaphysical argument against the freedom of the will, but how would you answer to the question, in what principal sense is Spinoza such a philosopher of freedom? How has he inspired the liberal and libertine movement, intellectual movement, despite the fact that he is also arguing against?
Well, I think that for Spinoza it's impossible to completely separate the political sphere from individual ethical sphere. And he does in fact say in one place that the wise person who studied and understands things may be able to achieve a higher individual level of behavior than others, but he can't be completely free if he lives in an unfree state where there's an impressive gap. Right. So part of our freedom is the result of a collective ability to achieve a political system in which decisions are reached by discussion and by a collective search for the common good. He's very, very keen on so there's a common good, which is extremely important in my opinion in Spinoza, as well as an individual good. And the pursuit of the best kind of life for the individual cannot be wholly separated from the collective pursuit for the best kind of life for society.
Do you agree, Yitzhak?
Basically, yes. I mean, I'll just add one thing. So, political freedom is lack of abuse, and inviting people to fulfill their potential in the maximal way. Now, like any other political aim, in order to materialize it, you need to understand how society functions. Now, there are different ways of doing politics. One kind of politics can be based on all kinds of semi-irrational myths, and I think that on that side, Kant and Hannah Arendt, for example, will fall on that insofar as they have this notion of evil, unexplainable evil, which is a kind of a black box. You cannot explain how it comes from. I mean, it's just, just like free will, they are coming together very closely. And just to give you an example, if you look at recent debates in the US about weapons violence, and you ask Republicans, what's the reason for that? And they say, evil, evil people. Yeah. Right? The alternative is to say, no, I'm sorry, it's not an issue of evil. You can explain everything, or if you wish evil, go use whatever you wish, but evil is explainable. It's not a holy thing that you cannot spell out what it is.
Right.
And I think that for Spinoza, the idea is if you want to change society, don't have black boxes. Because black boxes are such that you will not be able to address them. They come out of nowhere, you don't know how to manipulate them, you don't know how to deal with them. So whatever, if you have something which you don't know much about, then start working, think, try to understand that, try to understand its causes, and then change that.
Right. Just to say a little bit about the schedule, we could sit here and talk about Spinoza all through the night. We don't know about you. It's getting late. We should not go much later than 9:30, but there are at least one question from the audience that I would like to let in, which is Lasse Dencik, a very senior person in this society, who I know has a special interest in this. If you want to put your question, Lasse.
Yes, first of all, thank you for the very interesting evening. And I have a question on the idea of of radical enlightenment. Jonathan, you said at the conclusion of your talk that there is a Jewish angle to European enlightenment and European radical culture based on Spinoza's ideas. And I would like you to explore a little bit more how that Jewish angle has transformed into present-day society. How is the Jewish angle that you identified perceivable today in today's European culture? And then I have the arrogance of giving an answer to Yitzhak's kind of cliffhanger.
Okay.
I don't want to give the impression that the radical enlightenment had essentially Jewish roots. The point I wanted to make was that I think one of the roots of the radical enlightenment that developed in the late 17th century, with Spinoza as one of the main formative influences, was this Iberian Sephardic Maronist gatherings in to begin with, crypto-Jewish subterranean movements, which were often resulted in free-thinking deistic tendencies, as we see in Uriel da Costa or Juan de Prado, and I think that that is one of the roots. But I think the basic reason why the radical enlightenment developed into a powerful force in the 18th century and played a large part, I must say, in Jefferson and the Tom Paine and the American Revolution, and played a large part in the French Revolution afterwards, is simply that monarchy and the domination of society by aristocracy, such as you had in 18th century England, for example, Parliament and voting for Parliament, the people in Parliament were the lords and gentry of England, and other people played very, very little role, certainly no role at all in the decision-making or in the personnel in Parliament. I think that this, as reading spreads, and the proportion of society who are fairly highly educated increases, more and more people are dissatisfied with societies like that. It is illogical in the sense that it is highly unequal. And that inequality, combined with the oppressive instruments that are used to maintain the European systems of the 17th and 18th century, simply generates opposition and resistance. Whether it's in France or Germany or Scandinavia or Holland or Britain, doesn't really change that. It generates resistance. And I think that that resistance was bound to find a voice. So my answer would be that the radical enlightenment ultimately is simply rooted in the nature of Western society itself and in the impact of printing, science, and raising the general level on society, increasing the resistance to these rigid structures and the oppression that characterize them. So there was bound to be a radical enlightenment. There was a Jewish angle to it, but I wouldn't want to push that too hard, because I don't think that that's the very basis of the whole thing. As I say, it's much wider than that.
Lasse, you had a point about the cliffhanger, which I then toss off to Yitzhak.
Well, my take on that would be that...
so the cliffhanger, why was Spinoza excommunicated from his community?
Because he was a troublemaker. And because in the eyes of... the Jewish community in Amsterdam in those days lived in society where they had to be careful, as you said, Jonathan. They had to be cautious about what they do and what they... And here comes this young troublemaker, Spinoza, who's not even published anything yet, almost. And he's 23 years old. And he says not only something about the Jewish thing, he says something about Christianity and all these ideas that people should obey to. And in order to get rid of the kind of bad atmosphere that he would create, they get rid of him, excommunicate him, and that's a kind of a sociological explanation for why he was excommunicated. I don't know if you agree.
Well, troublemaker he was undoubtedly, but that's I think it's, to my mind, it's the most essential, most interesting characterization of Spinoza. I mean, he's not at the service of anyone. I mean, he's independent-minded, and you know, I like that. I mean, he's just shattering one idol after another. The question is, of course, what was the trouble that, of the many trouble that he was making, which one was the one that put him into the harem in July 56. And that's a...
Now you have to tell us your...
I had an hypothesis.
May I?
Yes, please. Since
My feeling is, and remember, he wasn't working on his own, but together with Juan de Prado and other people in the community. The Daniel Ribera that I mentioned before was very important in this respect because he was an auxiliary teacher within the community of non-religious subjects. All these people were encouraging the students to think in ways which would consider disrespectful or defiant of what the rabbis were teaching them. And there was a culture was being created of opposition to Mortera in particular, who was a rather domineering character, but not so much Manasseh ben Israel, but he, at the time this drama reached its climax, we must remember that Manasseh, who was perhaps the least rigid, let's put it that way, of the rabbis, was away in England trying to organize the readmission of the Jews to England. So he wasn't there actually at the time of the Cherem. And I think that my explanation is that and there's a Spanish language poet, a member of the community, Daniel Levy de Barrios, who describes the scenes, for example, in the evening classes, like the Yeshiva Keter Torah, where you had these evening class discussions. This is a perfect setting for Juan de Prado and Spinoza to say, sorry, Rabbi, because the rabbi was supposed to be presiding, we disagree with that, our opinion is this. And Barrios, who doesn't want to mention their names, but he underlines the two words in Spanish to make sure no one should fail to understand what he's saying, that when dealing with heresy is a way of containing the prados, which are meadows, and the thorny bushes, the espinosos, that are getting in the way, or something like that. And he underlines prados and espinosos and puts that in italic, just in case the less attentive readers would fail to immediately recognize what he was saying. Okay,
thank you. Do you want to add something?
So I'm toying with the idea of waiting with the answer so that you'll invite me again. But I'm not going to do that. I mean, so I'll just 2 words and nothing more than that. I think he got in trouble with the rabbis now, or with the community. Why? So there is one document, actually 2 documents, that were discovered by a Dutch scholar named Oded Vlessing about 20 years ago. The documents indicate a certain economic dispute between Spinoza and some members of the Jewish community there. Vlessing claims that that's the background for that. I don't think it's an economic issue. I think what happened there, in my suspicion, we know that Spinoza decided to adjudicate the case, bring it to the authority of Amsterdam instead of adjudicating within the Jewish community in Amsterdam. Now, that's actually a extremely common reason or excuse for the use of cherem. I mean, that's how a lot of times in many communities, when they wish to have the debate, any kind of internal disputes within the community, they want them to be educated within the community. The use is almost immediately, and time and again we have this phenomena. It's the use of cherem. Even today, so for example, ultra-Orthodox community in Israel does not recognize the authority of the Israeli courts, and if anyone in Jerusalem, in the ultra-Orthodox community, is going to the Israeli court, he will be put on cherem. So I think it's likely, again, I don't have, all I can say, I think it's likely that the first step, because the document is for 3 months before the cherem, I would be very much surprised if it's just a mere coincidence. My suspicion is that what happened was that Spinoza went to the court, to the authority of the courts in Amsterdam. The community told him, go back, you are not allowed to do that. He said, I could not care less about your regulations, rabbinic authority, or anything like that. What happened next was, again, I can imagine that. Now, all of this I'm saying needs documentation. So It's a speculation.
Yes.
I think more likely than others, but still a speculation.
Okay, thank you. I know there are more questions in the audience, but people are now getting tired and we need to change to... So please, those of you who have comments and questions, come up to the speakers afterwards, have a glass and continue the discussion. And thank you very much, all of you.